Detective Miles Carter froze as the printer finished spitting out the lab report. A single page that would rewrite half a century of silence. 54 years. That's how long the Hayes family had waited for a name. And now, a DNA match had surfaced. One that linked the 1971 murder of 22-year-old Carolyn Hayes to a man who had been living less than 2 miles from her old neighborhood. The suspect wasn't a stranger. He was a retired police officer. It was October 3rd, 1971, when Carolyn disappeared. A waitress at Billy's Diner in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, she'd worked the late shift that night. Her coworkers remembered she was cheerful as she clocked out. She had just gotten a promotion and was planning to attend her brother's wedding the following weekend. Around midnight, Carolyn walked to her car, a blue 1969 Ford Fairlane parked behind the diner under a flickering light. Witnesses saw her exchange a few words with a man standing near a black pickup truck. She never made it home. The next morning, her car was found 2 blocks away, doors locked, purse on the seat, keys missing. There was no sign of struggle, except a single torn button from her uniform caught in the doorframe. Police searched nearby fields, creeks, and back roads for weeks. Nothing. By December, the case had gone cold. Her parents, Walter and Ruth Hayes, pleaded publicly for answers. Ruth's trembling voice was broadcast on local radio. "Whoever you are, you took a daughter from us. But you can't take our faith." That faith would be tested for decades. Detective Harold Kinney, one of the original investigators, described the case as a ghost that followed me everywhere. In a 1989 interview, he said, "We had fingerprints, tire tracks, fibers, everything except the truth." The case file grew thicker every year, but never moved forward. Rumors spread across Tulsa. Some said Carolyn had been targeted by a customer. Others claimed she'd been abducted by a stranger passing through. But whispers always circled back to one thing: the diner. Several waitresses later admitted that someone on the police force used to frequent the diner after hours. An officer who would flirt with the younger girls and offer to walk them to their cars. His name was Officer Raymond Ray Dillard, a 27-year-old patrolman known for his charm and quick temper. In 1971, Dillard was briefly questioned after a witness claimed to have seen his truck parked near the diner that night. He denied it, saying he'd been responding to a domestic call on the east side. His alibi checked out, barely. With no hard evidence, the lead went nowhere. Over time, Dillard rose through the ranks, eventually retiring in the late 1990s. He moved to a quiet suburb outside Tulsa, living comfortably on his pension. The Hayes family moved away too, carrying only their grief. Ruth Hayes passed away in 2004, still writing letters every Christmas to the Tulsa Police Department asking, "Any news on my Carolyn?" In 2024, 53 years after the murder, the Oklahoma Cold Case Task Force reopened the Hayes file under Detective Miles Carter, a methodical, relentless investigator known for reviving the impossible. He had just solved a 1978 homicide using degraded DNA when he came across the Hayes file. The evidence box was yellowed with age, sealed with brittle tape and labeled in fading ink, "Hayes Carolyn, Tulsa, 1971, unsolved." Inside lay a folded uniform blouse, several old crime scene photos, and a manila envelope labeled "Trunk Evidence." Inside that envelope was a small glass vial containing a few strands of hair collected from the driver's seat of Carolyn's car. Carter sent the sample to the State Forensic Lab in Oklahoma City for advanced testing. Using next-generation sequencing, technology capable of extracting DNA from even the oldest biological material. He didn't expect much. Samples from that era were often contaminated or degraded. But 2 weeks later, the lab called back. "We got a viable profile," said the analyst, "and it's male." The DNA was uploaded to CODIS, but no direct matches appeared. Carter then turned to forensic genealogy, uploading the data to a national database that compared DNA with millions of public ancestry samples. It took only 10 days. A partial familial match linked the DNA to a man named Ryan Dillard, a 34-year-old software engineer living in Texas. After confirming Ryan's consent for comparison, analysts established a 99.9% probability that the DNA belonged to his father, Raymond Dillard, now 80 years old. Carter read the report twice. The same name that had appeared in the 1971 witness statements was now staring back at him, confirmed by science half a century later. He immediately requested archival access to the original police logs from that night. Within hours, he found what he needed, an altered dispatch record. It showed Dillard had indeed been assigned to a domestic call, but the time of response had been changed, overwritten by hand. The ink was newer. The alteration, forensic document examiners later proved, had been made after the initial report was filed. Someone, likely Dillard himself, had falsified his own alibi. Armed with the new DNA evidence, Carter obtained a search warrant for Dillard's property. When agents arrived at his suburban home in Broken Arrow, the elderly man opened the door calmly. "I was wondering when this day would come," he said. In his garage, investigators discovered a locked trunk beneath a workbench. Inside were several old police patches, newspaper clippings from the Hayes case, and a small locket containing Carolyn's photo. When confronted, Dillard said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. Then he exhaled deeply. "I never meant for it to go that far," he whispered. "I just wanted to talk to her." Carter leaned forward across the table. "You killed her," he said. Dillard nodded once. "Yes." The confession came in fragments. He admitted to following Carolyn after her shift that night, offering her a ride under the guise of protection. When she refused, he grabbed her arm. A struggle followed. "She hit me," he said quietly. "I just reacted." He claimed he strangled her in panic, then drove her car away to stage a disappearance. He dumped her body along the Arkansas River, where flooding later washed away nearly all trace evidence. When asked why he had kept the locket, he said, "To remind me, every day." The revelation hit Tulsa like a thunderclap. Local headlines screamed, "Retired officer confesses to 1971 murder after DNA match." News vans surrounded Dillard's quiet cul-de-sac. Neighbors were stunned. "He was kind, polite, always mowed everyone's lawns," one said. "I can't believe it." Former colleagues expressed disbelief. "Ray was old school, by the book," said a retired officer who'd served under him. If he could do that, anyone could. The Hayes family, now represented by Carolyn's niece, Emma Hayes, held a small press conference outside the Tulsa courthouse. "My grandmother waited her whole life for this," she said. "She didn't live to hear the truth, but at least it's finally spoken." Detective Carter, standing nearby, refused interviews. When asked by a reporter if he believed Dillard's remorse was genuine, he replied he had 53 years to confess. He waited until science cornered him. That's not guilt, that's fear. Within days, Dillard was charged with first-degree murder. Despite his age, prosecutors vowed to pursue full sentencing. "Justice has no expiration date," said District Attorney Lillian Rhodes. In court, the frail former officer sat quietly as prosecutors recounted every step of the 1971 investigation, every piece of evidence he'd manipulated to save himself. When the DNA report was read aloud, the courtroom fell silent. Carter watched from the gallery, hands folded. He'd spent months buried in files, chasing ghosts through paper trails. But this was the moment every cold case detective lived for. Proof. Closure. And yet, beneath the satisfaction was something darker. A realization that justice, when it arrives too late, feels like punishment without peace. Outside the courthouse, Emma Hayes approached Carter. "My grandmother would have wanted to thank you," she said softly. "She used to tell me that truth doesn't die, it just gets buried under fear." Carter smiled faintly. "Then we just had to dig deep enough." As she walked away, he glanced up at the courthouse clock, its hands frozen at 12:15, the exact time the original report listed as last seen. For half a century, time had stood still for Carolyn Hayes, and now it had finally started moving again. That night, back in his Tulsa office, Carter opened the evidence box one last time. He stared at the fragile strands of hair that had changed everything. 53 years they'd waited, sealed, forgotten, yet holding the truth the whole time. He closed the box carefully and placed it on a shelf labeled "Solved." Then he turned off the lights, whispering to himself the same line that had guided his work for years. Sometimes justice doesn't fade with time. It waits. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief when Raymond Dillard, a once respected Tulsa police officer, shuffled to the stand in his orange jumpsuit. The man who had once sworn to protect his community now sat exposed, not by confession, not by conscience, but by science. Detective Miles Carter sat quietly in the back row, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He had watched this moment unfold dozens of times across decades of cold cases, but this one felt different. Dillard wasn't just another murderer. He was part of the system, the same system that had buried the truth for half a century. When the prosecutor read the timeline aloud, the silence in the courtroom was heavy enough to hear the air conditioning hum. On the night of October 3, 1971, Officer Raymond Dillard intercepted Carolyn Hayes in the parking lot of Billy's Diner. He used his authority to make her feel safe. Then, he took her life. For 53 years, he let her family suffer while he hid behind a badge. Dillard didn't look up. His pale hands trembled slightly on the table. In Tulsa, news of the trial gripped the state like a fever. Local stations ran retrospectives on the Hayes case, grainy footage of the original search, old interviews with teary-eyed volunteers, black and white photos of detectives combing through muddy riverbanks. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, desperate for quotes from anyone who'd known Dillard. His former partner, now in his late 70s, spoke to a local outlet with a cracked voice. "He was my friend," he said. "He told me he'd been haunted by that girl's disappearance. Turns out, he wasn't haunted, he was hiding." The betrayal ran deep. For the Tulsa Police Department, this wasn't just a crime, it was a stain on history. Retired officers publicly apologized to the Hayes family. One wrote in a letter to the Tulsa World, "We swore an oath to serve truth, not protect our own." Dillard's actions broke that oath for all of us. During the second week of trial, forensic experts took the stand. The lead analyst from the Oklahoma State Crime Lab displayed a slide showing the original 1971 hair sample beside the newly sequenced DNA data. "This," she said, pointing to the projection, "is why we never destroy evidence. Time doesn't erase truth. It just waits for technology to catch up." Her statement drew murmurs from the crowd. It was the essence of every cold case, proof that the smallest fragment could one day speak louder than any witness. When it was his turn to testify, Detective Carter stepped to the stand with calm precision. The prosecutor asked him, "Detective Carter, what made you reopen this specific case?" Carter glanced toward the Hayes family. "Because the file was still open," he said simply. "Because her name was still waiting to be crossed off the list." He explained the process, how forensic genealogy narrowed down the lineage, how Dillard's family DNA sealed the match, and how an altered dispatch record from 1971 confirmed a deliberate cover-up. The defense attempted to argue contamination, citing the age of the sample, but the prosecution dismantled it quickly. The chain of custody was flawless, the lab director testified. The truth didn't degrade. It was preserved by chance and found by persistence. Outside the courthouse, Tulsa reacted with heartbreak and outrage for days. Radio shows buzzed with callers sharing memories of 1971, the year the Vietnam War raged. Nixon was in office, and the Hayes disappearance dominated headlines. One caller, now elderly, said, "We all thought she'd been taken by a stranger. We didn't know she'd been taken by someone wearing blue." Public trust in the old police institution crumbled. Editorials called for the creation of an independent investigative review board to handle officer-involved cold cases. For the first time, Oklahoma legislators discussed mandatory re-examinations of unsolved homicides involving law enforcement personnel. Detective Carter was asked to testify before the committee. Standing before lawmakers, he said, "We don't build trust by hiding our failures. We build it by confronting them, no matter how long it takes." That statement was replayed across every news channel in the state. Inside the Hayes family home, grief mingled with relief. Carolyn's niece, Emma Hayes, had become the family spokesperson, but her role went far beyond the microphones. Every night, she sorted through boxes of her grandmother's letters, the ones written to police over the years. "Any updates on my Carolyn?" one read. "Please don't forget her." Emma often said the DNA match didn't just solve a case, it brought Grandma's voice back from the grave. She organized a candlelight vigil in front of the old diner, now abandoned and boarded up, on what would have been Carolyn's 75th birthday. Hundreds came. Some had been children in 1971, remembering the search through the woods. Others were strangers, drawn by the story. As dusk fell, Emma stood on the same cracked asphalt where Carolyn had last been seen and spoke softly. "She's not a ghost anymore. She's a name, a voice, a daughter, and finally, she's seen." Detective Carter stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets. He didn't speak. He just listened. When the verdict finally came, it was no surprise. Guilty on all counts. Judge Elena March, in her closing remarks, said, "This court recognizes that the victim's family waited longer for justice than any family ever should. Let this verdict remind us that justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as someone keeps fighting for it." Dillard was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole, his frail frame slumping as the words echoed across the courtroom. Outside, reporters asked Carter what justice felt like after 53 years. He paused before answering. "Justice isn't a feeling," he said. "It's a responsibility." After the trial, Tulsa's police chief issued a public statement acknowledging systemic failure and announced the launch of the Hayes Review Program, a statewide cold case audit initiative named in Carolyn's memory. It aimed to re-examine all homicide cases older than 30 years using modern forensic tools. Funding was approved within a month. Soon, Oklahoma became a national model for how law enforcement could face its past. Major networks featured the story under titles like DNA, The Voice of the Dead. Detective Carter, though, stayed out of the spotlight. He returned to his small office. Walls lined with file boxes marked unsolved. He took one down, a 1982 missing persons case, and placed it on his desk. His assistant asked, "You're starting another one already?" Carter nodded. "The truth doesn't wait," he said. "Neither should we." Despite the system's renewal, not everyone could find peace. Some of Dillard's former colleagues struggled to reconcile the man they'd known with the monster he'd become. One retired captain wrote in his diary, later published anonymously, "If he could hide a secret like that for 50 years, how many others did we miss?" The question haunted many. Meanwhile, in prison, Dillard became a reluctant symbol, the face of guilt that outlived its excuses. In his first and only interview, he said quietly, "I used to think silence was safety. Now I know it's just another kind of death." When asked if he regretted what he did, he paused, then whispered, "I regret not stopping myself." The recording of that interview circulated online, reaching millions of views in days. But for Detective Carter, those words meant nothing. "Regret isn't justice," he told a reporter. "Action is." The Hayes family used the settlement from the case to establish the Carolyn Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping fund DNA testing for unsolved murders in rural Oklahoma. Within a year, the foundation helped reopen 4 cases, leading to 2 arrests. Emma Hayes told local news, "Every time we fund a new test, I feel like Carolyn's story is still working." Her words inspired a movement. Students at Tulsa University's Criminal Justice Program created an annual scholarship for forensic science majors in Carolyn's name. The first recipient wrote in her essay, "Because of her, I believe the past can still speak, if we learn to listen in the right ways." In the fall of 2025, a year after the trial, the state dedicated a memorial near the Arkansas River, the same place Dillard confessed to dumping Carolyn's body. The plaque read, "Here, the truth resurfaced after 53 years. May it never sink again." During the dedication ceremony, Detective Carter spoke briefly. "This case isn't about death. It's about discovery. It's about the people who refused to stop asking, even when the world stopped listening." He stepped away from the microphone, standing quietly beside Emma as the crowd released white balloons over the river. They floated upward until the gray clouds swallowed them whole. That evening, Carter drove back toward Tulsa. The city glowed under a violet sunset, the skyline reflecting across the Arkansas River. As he passed the old diner, now overgrown and silent, he slowed the car, staring at the crumbling sign that once read Billy's Diner, open late. He pulled over, stepped out, and stood on the cracked pavement. The air smelled faintly of rain. Closing his eyes, he could almost hear the faint echo of a jukebox, laughter, the clatter of dishes, a night that had frozen in time. He whispered, "We didn't forget you, Carolyn. We just needed the world to catch up." And as he got back into his car, the neon light flickered one last time behind him, dim but still alive. The storm rolled over Tulsa that evening, thunder echoing across the flat Oklahoma plains as Detective Miles Carter drove through the rain-slicked streets. His windshield wipers beat a slow rhythm, steady, mechanical, relentless, much like the cases that consumed his life. The Dillard verdict was behind him. The cameras, the reporters, the state hearings, all of it had faded into silence. But the echoes of the case still lingered, not just in the courthouse records, but in the quiet corners of Oklahoma's memory. Carter wasn't heading home. He was driving toward a new site, a clearing along the Arkansas River, now the official memorial ground for Carolyn Hayes. It had been nearly a year since Dillard's sentencing, and tonight the town was holding a candlelight remembrance. The storm threatened to wash it out, but that didn't matter. Carter knew people would still come. He parked near the edge of the path, where fresh rain darkened the grass. As he stepped out, lightning flashed across the riverbank, illuminating the bronze plaque that bore Carolyn's name. Beneath it, etched in steel, "Truth buried is never truth lost." He stood for a long moment, watching as townspeople gathered under umbrellas, candles flickering despite the wind. The Carolyn Hayes Foundation had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. In 1 year, it had funded 47 forensic retests across multiple states, directly contributing to 6 new case breakthroughs. News outlets called it the Hayes Effect. But for Carter, numbers meant little. What mattered were the faces, the families who stopped by his office, clutching photographs yellowed by time, whispering, "Can you look at ours next?" He never said no. As the memorial began, Emma Hayes took the microphone. Her voice carried softly through the humid air, even as thunder rolled behind her. "When my grandmother started writing letters in 1971, she never imagined her words would still be heard in 2024. But that's the power of truth. It doesn't stop knocking just because no one answers." The crowd stood silent. Some wept. Others held photos of their own lost loved ones, their candles glowing like tiny promises against the night. Emma continued, her voice trembling only once. For years, this river was a symbol of what we lost. Tonight, it's where we take it back. Carter bowed his head. He thought about the locket found in Dillard's garage, the one with Carolyn's photo. The evidence team had offered to destroy it after the trial. Instead, Carter had it sealed, tagged, and placed in the state's cold case archive. Some things, he'd told the archivist, don't belong to one man's guilt. They belong to history. When the storm finally broke, rain poured down in sheets, yet no one left. Candles sputtered, umbrellas turned inside out, and still they stood, defying the storm just as the Hayes family had defied time. Carter stepped forward when Emma gestured to him. He took the mic reluctantly, rain dripping from his coat. The first time I opened Carolyn's file, he said, I thought I was chasing a ghost. But I wasn't. I was chasing everyone who gave up. Every detective, every lead, every unanswered letter. That's what we do in this job. We don't just hunt killers. We hunt silence. He paused, letting the rain fill the quiet. 53 years is a long time to wait for a voice. But DNA doesn't forget, and neither should we. The crowd erupted into applause, some clapping, others sobbing. For the first time in decades, Tulsa didn't feel haunted. It felt awake. In the months that followed, Oklahoma underwent a quiet revolution. The Hayes Review Program evolved into a full state bureau, equipped with AI-assisted evidence scanning and an advanced genealogical database funded by private donors. Across the state, sealed boxes once thought worthless were reopened. By early 2026, more than a dozen cold cases had been solved, many older than the Hayes case itself. The Tulsa Herald published a feature titled, The Detective Who Made Time Talk. Carter didn't grant interviews, but when a young journalist sent him a handwritten note asking, "How do you keep doing it?" he mailed back the single line, "Because truth doesn't ask for permission, it just waits for someone to listen." Not long after, Carter was invited to lecture at the National Forensic Symposium in Washington, D.C. His topic, How DNA Brought Just to Oklahoma. He stood before hundreds of detectives, scientists, and law students. Instead of PowerPoint slides, he brought one item, the 1971 evidence box from the Hayes case, preserved exactly as it had been found. This, he said, setting it on the table, is what 50 years of silence looks like. And this, he held up a photo of Carolyn smiling behind the diner counter, is what it sounds like when truth finally speaks. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, but Carter only nodded once and quietly stepped down from the stage. He'd never cared about applause, only results. Back home, his life returned to the familiar rhythm of reports, reopenings, and long nights staring at case files that smelled of dust and old paper. Yet something inside him had changed. The Hayes case had reminded him that justice wasn't a finish line. It was a relay. Every generation handed the baton to the next, hoping someone else would carry it further. He began mentoring young detectives, teaching them how to read the patterns in cold cases, how to listen to families who had been ignored for decades. He made them repeat one mantra before they ever touched a file. We don't reopen cases to find guilt. We reopen them to find truth. By the summer of 2026, the Carolyn Hayes Memorial Center for Forensic Justice opened its doors in downtown Tulsa, a collaboration between the state and the Hayes Foundation. Emma Hayes cut the ribbon beside Carter, smiling through tears. Inside, framed on the main wall, was a plaque that read, "Dedicated to every detective who refused to let time win." Visitors could see the preserved items from the case, the diner uniform, the hair vial, the black and white photo of Carolyn's car under the streetlight. People whispered as they walked through, reverent as if in a church. One teenager stopped in front of Carolyn's photo and said, "She looks happy." Emma smiled softly. She was, she said. And now she's finally at peace. That night, Carter drove out to the river one last time. The city was quiet, the stars sharp against the dark Oklahoma sky. He parked near the memorial and stepped out, the air cool and still. The water shimmered faintly under the moonlight, the same water that had once concealed the truth, now reflecting it. He pulled out a small notebook from his coat pocket, his private log, the one he'd kept since his first cold case. He flipped to a blank page and wrote 3 words, "Case finally home." Then he tore the page out, folded it carefully, and tucked it under a stone near the plaque. As he stood there, a soft wind moved through the reeds, rustling like distant whispers. He could almost hear a voice, not haunting, but grateful. "Thank you." Carter smiled faintly. "You're welcome, Carolyn." Weeks later, a local filmmaker premiered a short documentary titled 1971, The Case That Waited. The closing shot was of Carter walking along the riverbank, hands in his pockets, the voiceover saying, "Sometimes justice isn't a hammer. It's a whisper that refuses to die." The film went viral, shared by law enforcement academies across the country. Within months, Oklahoma's cold case model was adopted in 6 other states. The ripple effect was undeniable, all from a few strands of hair, preserved by accident, discovered by persistence. Years later, when Carter finally retired, his office shelves were lined with evidence boxes stamped "Solved." The Hayes file sat in the center, sealed once more, but this time not in silence. His final day on the job was unremarkable. No cameras, no speeches. Just a man closing his desk drawer for the last time. As he left, he paused by the window, watching the city skyline shimmer in the man. He whispered to himself, "You can rest now." Months after his retirement, on a quiet autumn evening, Carter returned to the memorial for the final time. The trees along the river had turned gold. The air was crisp, and a gentle current rippled over the stones. He sat on the bench, hands clasped, listening to the steady flow of water. In the distance, children laughed. A school field trip visiting the memorial. He smiled faintly. That, he thought, was what justice really meant, a future that could laugh again. He stood, brushed off his coat, and took one last look at Carolyn's name on the plaque. "Sometimes justice doesn't fade with time," he said quietly. "It waits." Then he walked away down the path, disappearing into the orange Oklahoma sunset. The last detective of a story that refused to die. And as the wind swept through the riverbank, the candles flickered one final time, soft, steady, eternal.